hope you've been able to join us over the past few weeks for our series, Love, Sex, and Marriage. And we've enjoyed talking about things like attraction, dating, and intimacy in marriage. We've learned what the Bible has to say about these important issues. And as part of that series, when we talked about attraction, we talked about those of us who aren't married needing to learn to be attracted to the right things. And those of us who are married, we are supposed to encourage our spouse in the things that they're good at so that they'll be more attractive to us. And then we moved on to dating, and we learned that dating can be a great time to get to know someone if we're ready. You know, are we comfortable in being single? Have we worked on ourselves? Are we right with God? Those were the questions we asked ourselves. So last week we talked about intimacy within marriage and what kind of a beautiful oasis that is, that it was created by God as a time to be shared and to be unified together. And now this week, we get to follow our couple after all this wonderful things of attraction and dating and being married and their honeymoon night, and we get to follow them into their first fight. And, you know, I like to think that Dave chose me to talk about this because I'm a great speaker, but maybe it's because I have red hair and I'm pretty feisty. And so I got to thinking about marital conflict, and of course I had to think about fighting that Mike and I have done. And you have to remember, I'm going to tell you a story, and remember that I'm the one up here talking, so it's probably being told from my side of the story. But I'm going to do my best to tell both sides. So it was about 15 years ago. I was a young mom. I was working full-time, and Hope was going to a Christian school and doing carpool, and I was stressed out. I was to the breaking point. So I did what I like to do. I made a list. I was making a list of everything I needed to do, and I decided that a simple list on paper was not going to be enough. This list required a spreadsheet. So I got out my computer, and I started typing up all the things I needed to do, and then I assigned times to them because I was going to be organized, and I was going to figure this out. And then I hit that magic Sigma button, you know, the one that adds it all up, and I determined there was not enough time in the day to get everything done that was on my list. And so, of course, whose fault was that? That was Mike's fault. And so I took him the spreadsheet, and I said, here, you need to start helping out a little bit more around here because this is not working. And you can imagine that went really well. So he began, like all good accountants would, he had to question the data in the spreadsheet. And he said, are you kidding me? Does it take you an hour to mop the floor every week? You don't do that every week. I was like, yeah, I know. That's the point. There's no time to do it every week. And because to me, all it seemed like Mike did was go to work every day and mow the lawn once a week. So I thought he could take a few things off my side of the list and put it onto his. But he decided this spreadsheet needed some editing. So he sat down at the computer and added all the things that I had neglected to put on his side. Don't you love how two accountants use a spreadsheet to fight? And so he put his things, and then of course, I'm a good CPA too, so I had to question his data. And I said, are you kidding me? Sweeping the garage floor, like you really do that every week. And it does not take an hour, okay? So we were fighting. And do you think there was some yelling? Perhaps on my side, yes, there was. And there was yelling, there were sighs of unbelief, there was general nastiness, and that was just from me. On Mike's side, there was a lot of avoidance. He was just walking away. So we went back and forth on this issue for quite some time until Mike took a step towards reconciliation when he agreed to do some things. Would you believe he agreed to do the laundry, and he agreed to pay the bills for me? And even though now I do the laundry, I don't really trust him anymore, but that's another story. I'm at home full time, so I do the laundry now, but I still remember 15 years later that Mike did those things for a season to be helpful. And he did it even though I was pretty nasty about it. And now I'm going to bet that none of you have ever used a spreadsheet as ammunition for an argument. But I bet that you have fought over household chores, or maybe you've fought over how to discipline your kids, or whether or not to even have kids, or what church to go to, or finances. I mean, the list can go on and on about the things we fight about. And that is because conflict is an inevitable part of our relationships. And that's important why it's important for all of us to tune in, not just those of us who are married, but maybe you just have friends in your life, or you have a roommate in college, or even your parents. You have relationships with them, and so you will inevitably have conflict. And when you do get into a disagreement, the question is not whether it will happen, but whether when it does, will your relationship weather the storm, or will it build a wall of China between the two of you? And I'm hoping that you will want to learn these healthy conflict resolution skills now, rather than just wing it down the road if you do decide to get married. And I'll bet we're in agreement that we would much rather have these stronger, deeper relationships and healthy skills for the future. So we're very fortunate that our all-knowing, wise, sovereign God left us some wisdom in the Bible. He lets us actually witness some conflict. And this wisdom comes from Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived. So if you could open your Bibles now to Song of Solomon, we're going to turn there and see what that wise man said to us. We're going to start at chapter 5, and we're starting in verse 2. And we'll eventually end up at the end of chapter 6. Here we are. We're picking up after some pretty steamy scenes last week. Intimate times between a husband and wife, all in the Bible. But all does not stay so ideal. The honeymoon is over, so to speak. Here we're going to see them react differently to each other than we ever have, and they're going to have their first fight. So let's put this into perspective. We have 2 chapters in this book on fighting, and only one on intimacy and one on dating. So we certainly can get from this that marital conflict is a very important subject. And we could even take it as far as saying that you might spend 25% of your married life fighting, but I hope not. So let's read on and see how this couple deals with the recorded dispute of their first recorded dispute. Chapter 5, verse 2. The woman says, "I slept, but my heart was awake. Listen, my beloved is knocking." And then he says, "Open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my flawless one. My head is drenched with dew, my hair with the dampness of night." In other words, he's saying, "I'm cold, let me in." And then she replies in verse 3, "I've taken off my robe, must I put it on again? I've washed my feet, must I soil them again?" So here it is. It's their first argument, and it's about intimate times, but really, it's about a lot more than that. It seems that our beautiful married couple had planned to have an intimate evening together, but the husband came home late. So, imagine that, right? So she is asleep. Instead of leaving her to rest peacefully, he's thinking, hey, better late than never. And he tries to woo her with some sweet talk, because in all honesty, that has worked many times for him in the past. So she does not respond, though, quite like she has in the past. She responds with the equivalent of the modern day, "I have a headache." And she is not in the mood now that he didn't come home when he said he would, and she has fallen asleep. So who's at fault here? Well, they both are, in my opinion, because they're both being selfish. He's selfish because he thinks he's at the Burger King drive-through window where he can get it his way right away. And she is selfish too. She won't let him in because it's inconvenient. She's tired. She's not enthusiastic about being intimate with her husband. Notice how she uses the word "I" 4 times in a row. It's all about her. So they're both selfish. Let's see what happens next in verse 4. "My lover thrust his hand through the latch opening. My heart began to pound for him." So here we see he takes some initiative by putting his hand through the door latch. Kind of picture a little door within a door where he opened that and put his hand through. But he did not unlock the door and force his way in. And she responds. Her heart is now pounding for him. And this brings us to a really important point. When conflict comes, take a step forward. Because he took a step forward, what does she do? She stops thinking of only herself and starts thinking about her husband. From here to the beginning of the next chapter, every verse except verse 7 is about her beloved. Verses 5 and 6 say, "I arose to open for my lover, and my hands dripped with myrrh.
my fingers with flowing myrrh on the handles of the lock. I opened for my lover, but my lover had left. He was gone. My heart sank at his departure. I looked for him, but did not find him. I called him, but he did not answer. And we're all thinking, what just happened here? You have to remember this is poetry, and sometimes it's hard to understand. We don't know for sure, but it seems like quite a bit of time passed between his initial putting his hand through the door and then her actually going to the door. Maybe she did get dressed and make herself beautiful for him because now he is gone. And this reference to myrrh we see here, myrrh was kind of the perfume or cologne of the day, and he has put that on the door to remind her of him, kind of left a calling card of sorts behind. And now she wants nothing more than to be with her husband. So instead of being selfish, she has turned the card over and is being selfless. She is seeking him out, which is actually something that is very dangerous to do at this day and age. It was pitch dark. It was very dangerous for a young woman to be outside alone at night. She risks not only her safety, but also her reputation. If we look at the Bible in Proverbs 7 and Job 24, we see that the only people who had any business being outside at night were people you didn't want to be around or be thought you were one of them. They were prostitutes, they were murderers, and they were thieves. But all she can think of is being reunited with her husband. And her selflessness does not come without a cost, as we see in verses 7 and 8. The watchmen found me as they made their rounds in the city. They beat me. They bruised me. They took away my cloak, those watchmen on the walls. Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you, if you find my beloved, what will you tell him? Tell him I am faint with love. Even after the harsh treatment she received from the watchmen, she doesn't give up. And why? Because she is not her focus. He is. She is committed, a key part to making any relationship work. Just as he took some initiative earlier, she is taking some initiative now. Because when conflict comes, we need to take a step forward. Besides seeking him out, what step forward is she taking? Her friends ask in verse 9, "What's good about your husband? Why should we tell him?" And she answers with this beautiful description of the things she loves about her husband. Not a negative word does she utter, even though they've just been in an argument, and she could certainly complain about him to her friends. But instead, she says these wonderful things. And as we read them, I want you to think about things you love about your husband or your wife or your fiancé. And single people, think about the things you value in your best friend or your roommate or someone else you're in a relationship with. Because we're going to need those things in a few minutes. Here she goes in verse 10 with the only inventory of a man's features in the entire Bible. It tells you how unique this is. And one of very few from the ancient world. And while these words wouldn't probably be the words we would use, you can see how beautiful they are. My beloved is radiant and ruddy, outstanding among 10,000. His head is purest gold. His hair is wavy and black as a raven. I could say that about Mike, I suppose. But his eyes are like doves by the water streams, washed in milk, mounted like jewels. His cheeks are like beds of spice, yielding perfume. His lips are like lilies dripping with myrrh. His arms are rods of gold set with topaz. His body is like polished ivory decorated with lapis lazuli, whatever that is, we don't really know. His legs are pillars of marble set on bases of pure gold. His appearance is like Lebanon, choice as its cedars. His mouth is sweetness itself. He is altogether lovely. This is my beloved. This is my friend, daughters of Jerusalem. So even though she says no negative thing about him, she inventories his features using beautiful jewels, precious metals, and flowers to describe his handsomeness. And then she goes on to say that he is like the cedars of Lebanon, trees which back in that day were so prized and so important. They were valued for their quality, their strength, their nice smell, and their resistance to decay. They were of such great worth that they were sought after and imported, when importing was not exactly an easy thing to do, for Solomon's famed temple. Her husband is a man of quality. He is strong, he is worth seeking after. Beyond his good looks and strength, she ends with the most important, his friendship. She misses his companionship. She actually likes being around him. And that's why she wants him to return. And that's why when conflict comes, we have to take a step forward. As we continue reading in chapter 6, we see that she actually does find her husband, and their reunion is sweet and special. She reestablishes her commitment to him. In verse 3, she says one of the most beautiful things in the midst of conflict. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. Why is this beautiful? Because she hasn't let the conflict change her commitment to him. And she knows that her husband is still committed to her as well. And while we don't hear either of them utter the words, I'm sorry, we do see him come to her and tell her again that he sees her as beautiful and lovely and unique, as we've seen him do many times in the chapters before this. He doesn't just remember it in his mind, but he actually speaks them aloud to her. And as the passage concludes in verse 13, we see her friends calling her back. And we get this picture that she is dancing away with her beloved. She is doing the dance of Mahanaim, it says here. And in order to really understand the significance of that, we kind of have to go back and understand where that comes from. It goes back to Genesis 31, and Jacob was approaching his brother Esau after they had been separated due to conflict for 20 years. He names the camp Mahanaim, or two camps, because he's praying that those two camps will become one again. Here we see she's doing the dance of Mahanaim, or the dance of reconciliation. The conflict has brought them closer together, and they are off to experience the beauty of intimacy within their marriage, because when conflict came, they took a step forward. Her steps were seeking him out, remembering the good about him, and not letting the conflict sway her commitment to him. His steps were not forcing his way in and speaking sweet words of love and reassurance to his wife. So how does all of this apply to our lives today? What can work here in the year 2015? What are some steps forward we should take when conflict comes? Because we know it will. And just like both parties did in this verse, we should remember the good. We need to remember why we love our spouse in the first place. They never spoke negatively about each other to their friends. They remembered the good. Single people, remember your friend or your roommate or your boyfriend or your girlfriend. You chose them because there was something good about them. And those of us who are married, remember we chose this person because we love them. And remember that huge party you had to tell everybody that? And you had vows where you promised to love them even when it was hard? Do you remember that? I'm sure you do, and I'm sure you've been told that before, but I'm just asking you to kind of let it sink in again today, because it's so important to not remember the bad. If you think about the good times, and you think about the great memories, and you think about the special things about that person you love, and then think about what your life would be like if all those things were gone. That's what can happen when we focus on the negative. That's what can happen when we let conflict divide us instead of bringing us closer. And some of you are thinking right now, I know you are, you're thinking, but Shawna, you have no idea who I am married to. He is difficult, or she is mean and nasty, or he is never even here, or she is always nagging. And you know what? You're right. I don't know the real man or woman that you married. You probably know them the best of anyone. And because you know them the best of anyone, it's your job to remember the good. You know that even though right now maybe she's not being very nice, she has the ability to be sweet and kind. And you know that he has the ability to be funny and smart. And remember a few minutes ago when I asked you to think about those good things about that person? I want to take some time right now for you to write those down. So if you can reach under your seat, there should be some sticky notes under your seat and a pen. And I want you to take just 1 minute. We're going to take 1 minute and we're going to write down 3 things about either our spouse or someone else in our lives. Are we having trouble finding sticky notes? We gave this job to the kids earlier, so it could be difficult. But I want you to think of three things that you value about your best friend or your boyfriend or your girlfriend, or even if your parents, that's who you get into conflict most with. And we're just going to take 1 minute to do that right now. All right, well, hopefully that minute was long enough for you to think of just three things that you really value about that special person in your life. And I just want to share one of mine with you. I'm not going to ask anybody else to share, don't worry. One of mine is that Mike is a great protector. Just last week, we were out on our run, and this pit bull came charging after us, and I've been bit by dogs 3 times. I was very, very scared. And Mike took a step in front of me and faced that dog head on. And so I'm just appreciative for the protector that he is. Thank you, Mike. So what I want the rest of you, yes, thank you, Mike, for saving our lives. Turns out the dog was tied up, but it was all good. We did not know that at the time. So when you get home, I want you to put that sticky note in a place where you will see it. I want you to ponder it and maybe even memorize it. Because the next time that person does something that just drives you crazy, I want you to think about those 3 things. It will go a long way toward resolving conflict. Another step forward is to learn to fight fair. Some of you are facing much bigger obstacles than annoying habits or selfishness, and you find yourself in conflict quite often, maybe nearly all the time. And if we learn to fight fair, we can use that conflict to actually get us somewhere. There's a study done here by the University of Denver, a long-term study on marriage. And that study says that your odds of getting divorced are 85 to 90% if you fight in one of these 3 negative fighting styles. So we can look at that and say, ouch, that is bad news. Or we can look at it and say, well, the 85 to 90% odds if you have this. So how do I get myself over here so that I won't be in this 85 to 90% category? Well, let's talk about what those negative fighting styles are first. And the first one I think you'll find is quite common. The first one is where one person gets very angry and the other person shuts down or leaves, either physically or emotionally. The more the one shuts down, guess what? The angrier the other one gets. And it just escalates the fighting. The reason this results in divorce is that nothing is getting solved. And guess what? This was Mike and me. And I'm sure you can guess who might be the angry one. But, yeah, that was me. And Mike, like most people, didn't like being yelled at. Imagine that. So I had to learn that nothing was getting solved with yelling because it would just lead Mike shutting down. I had to learn that Mike needed me to be calm. And was that hard? Yes. But is it worth it to be able to get somewhere when we have conflict? Definitely. Negative style number 2 is where neither person gets angry. And you would think at first that seems good. But the problem here is that important things carry a lot of emotion. And when that anger is repressed, it turns into depression or indifference. And again, nothing is getting solved. And the third negative style is where both people are just screaming at each other and nobody's listening. And once again, nothing is getting solved. Often what happens in this case is that one of them gives up screaming, and the other one keeps on doing it, and we're back to negative fighting style number 1. So that's the bad news. Those are the bad categories which result in an 85 to 90% divorce rate. But the good news is that you can learn to fight fair. You can change and eliminate that possibility of divorce. And there are experts in the field, and these people have given us some advice. One of those is to try refighting, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It means that when you did a bad job of fighting, your emotions got the best of you and things did not go well, to go back and do it over, but obviously to do it over in a different way. And they gave a few ideas for being able to do it differently. One of those had to do with a pen. And that pen was to be used kind of as the microphone. The person who holds the pen gets to talk, and the other person gets to listen. And then when you put the pen down, it's the other person's turn. So that kind of avoids the back and forth screaming and yelling at each other. And timeouts. Timeouts are not just for children. If things get too emotional, either party can call for a timeout, but for a certain period of time, either 10 minutes or half an hour. And they have to actually communicate it. Just leaving is not a timeout. Then you can reconvene and try again. And another great skill that these experts tell us is to listen. Author and speaker Bryant McGill said, one of the most sincerest forms of respect is to actually listen to what one another has to say. The best way to understand people is to listen to them. And remember, you love this person, so listen to them. Another great piece of advice is to commit while you're not fighting to eliminate the D word or divorce. Commit to each other that in the heat of the moment, you will not say that word. Don't even make it an option. Don't allow yourselves to say, well, let's just end it then. Let's get a divorce. Or, I'm out of here. Let's get a divorce. It's not okay, no matter how upset you are. Beyond these practical ideas from these experts in the field, we have an even bigger advantage because we serve a God who is in the business of changing lives for the better. We need to pray to him. We need to spend time with him. And as we pray to him, we can pray for him to change us and make us more loving, and we can pray for him to change our spouse, but don't try to do it yourself. That never goes well. As you spend time with God, I would recommend contemplating 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, and ask God to use the Holy Spirit to make you more loving. Just think about how you respond when someone treats you lovingly versus how you respond when someone treats you nastily. And I think you'll find that those around you will be much easier to get along with if you're treating them lovingly. And last but not least is to forgive. Be willing to forgive your spouse. As we begin to realize how much we've been forgiven, that we continually let our Heavenly Father down, yet he continually forgives us, it becomes easy to forgive others. Particularly that certain someone that we've committed to love and cherish for the rest of our lives. One last step forward is to seek professional help. If the young woman in the Song of Solomon was willing to risk her life for her person she loved, your marriage is worth investing in counseling when times are tough. Maybe you've tried many of these things and you don't feel like you're getting anywhere. Well, I urge you not to give up. Instead, I urge you to get professional help. Pastor Dave and Pastor Lisa have great resources that they are willing to give you if you need them. There are people in this room right now who have been through counseling, and they are sitting here as a story to say that it does work. And some of you are thinking, you know what? This all sounds great, but I don't think it will work for me. Maybe you've already suffered the pain from divorce. And if you feel guilt from that time, then I just ask you to remember that we serve a God who forgives if we just ask. We serve a God who can change us and can help us through conflict to deeper relationships. God gave us this example of conflict and taking a step toward reconciliation because he wants us to improve our existing relationships and be ready for those in the future. And there are real people who have seen miraculous changes in their marriage and relationships due to God. One is Louis Zamperini, profiled in the book Unbroken. I listened to this book on my trip to and from Lincoln, Nebraska last weekend, and I was deeply moved by his story. From what I understand, the movie doesn't compare to the book, as is usual. So if you've seen that, I'm going to ask you to kind of just put it out of your mind for now. And the book is 400 pages long, and I'm going to try to summarize that before I read you just a couple of pages of the most moving part. So Zamperini's life started out pretty rough. He was basically a juvenile delinquent. But then he found running. He ran at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, Germany. And even though he didn't medal there, he had an amazing showing, running the fastest 5,000-meter time for any American man in 1936. So he set his sights on gold, for the Olympics 4 years down the road in 1940, which, as most of you know, would be a dream that would never come true due to World War II. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Louis joined the Army Air Corps and was a bomber on board a B-24. While he was on a rescue mission, the plane malfunctioned and crashed into the South Pacific. He and 2 others on the plane survived the crash, and they boarded 2 life rafts. They floated for weeks in the South Pacific, enduring attacks by the Japanese, circling sharks, and of course, hunger and thirst. They only received water when it rained. Then he was captured by the Japanese as a prisoner of war, and things did not get better. They actually took a turn for the worse. For the next 3 years, Louis would be subjected to unspeakable torture. He was fed only meager rations of spoiled food and drank only small amounts of dirty water, which were small things in comparison to being beaten by the guards for no reason and being forced to work in deadly conditions, basically as a slave. There was one guard who made it his personal mission to break Louis. He beat him physically countless times, many times using a large belt buckle and hitting him on the side of the head. He made him perform filthy, degrading work and did anything he could to break his spirit. Louis nicknamed this man the Bird. Amazingly, Louis survived all of these harrowing ordeals, and luckily we won the war. He was able to come home to California after the war was over, but he didn't leave the horrors of the war behind him. The Bird returned to him every night in horrible nightmares, and during the day he endured these terrifying flashbacks to his horrible time back in Japanese prison. He was alive, but he was suffering greatly. So he turned to alcohol to try and force the bad memories away. He had married this lovely young lady, Cynthia, and actually had a child, but Louis was sinking further and further into despair. Cynthia actually said she was going to divorce him. Their lives were just full, always full of fighting. And then one day, right after that, they met a couple in their apartment building who said they were going to hear an evangelist speak, and they invited them to come with them to hear Billy Graham. Cynthia went that evening. She came home and she told Louis, "I'm not going to divorce you." She begged him to come hear Graham speak, but Louis declined. Over and over, she begged him until finally he relented. He went and heard Graham speak, but instead of being converted, he became angered at Graham's words about being a sinner. He actually left the building when Graham was asking for people to commit their lives to Jesus. And that's where we pick up in the book, and I'm going to let the best-selling author's words speak from here. That night, Louis lay helpless as the belt whipped his head. The body that hunched over him was that of the Bird. The face was that of the devil. Louis rose from his nightmares to find Cynthia there. All morning Sunday, she tried to coax him into seeing Graham again. Louis, angry and threatened, refused. For several hours, Cynthia and Louis argued. Exhausted by her persistence, Louis finally agreed to go, but with one caveat. When Graham said, every head bowed, every eye closed, they were leaving. Under the tent that night, Graham spoke of how the world was in an age of war, an age defined by persecution and suffering. Why, Graham asked, is God silent while good men suffer? He began his answer by asking his audience to consider the evening sky. If you look into the heavens tonight, on this beautiful California night, I see the stars and can see the footprints of God, he said. I think to myself, my Father, my heavenly Father, hung them there with a flaming fingertip and holds them there with the power of his omnipotent hand. And he runs the whole universe, and he's not too busy running the whole universe to count the hairs on my head and to see a sparrow when it falls, because God is interested in me. God spoke in creation. Louis was winding tight. He remembered the day when he and Phil, slowly dying on that raft, had slid into the doldrums. Above, the sky had been a beautiful swirl of light. Below, the stilled ocean had mirrored the sky, its clarity broken only by a leaping fish. Awed to silence and actually forgetting his thirst and hunger, forgetting that he was dying, Louis had known only gratitude. That day, he had believed that what lay around them was the work of infinitely broad, benevolent hands, a gift of compassion. In the years since, that thought had been lost. Graham went on. He spoke of God reaching into the world through miracles and the intangible blessings that give men the strength to outlast their sorrows. God works miracles one after another, he said. God says, if you suffer, I'll give you the grace to go forward. Louis found himself thinking of the moment at which he had woken in the sinking hull of that B-24. The wires that had trapped him a moment earlier now inexplicably were gone. And he remembered the Japanese bomber swooping over the rafts, riddling them with bullets. And yet not a single bullet had struck him, Phil, or Mac. He had fallen into unbearably cruel worlds, and yet he had borne them. When he turned these memories in his mind, the only explanation he could find was one in which the impossible was possible. What God asks of men, said Graham, is faith. His invisibility is the truest test of that faith. To know who sees him, God makes himself unseen. Louis shone with sweat. He felt accused, cornered, pressed by a frantic urge to flee. As Graham asked for heads to bow and eyes to close, Louis stood abruptly and rushed for the street, towing Cynthia behind him. Nobody leaving, said Graham. You can leave while I'm preaching, but not now. Everybody is still and quiet. Every head bowed, every eye closed, and he asked for the faithful to come forward. Louis pushed past everyone in his row, charging for the exit. His mind was tumbling. He felt enraged, violent, on the edge of explosion. He wanted to hit someone. And as he reached the aisle, he stopped. Everything disappeared. A memory, long beaten back, the memory from which he had run the evening before, was upon him. Louis was on the raft. There was gentle Phil crumpled up before him. Mac's breathing skeleton, endless ocean stretching away in every direction, the sun beating over them, the cunning bodies of the sharks waiting and circling. He was a body on a raft, dying of thirst. He felt words whisper from his swollen lips. It was a promise thrown at heaven, a promise he had not kept, a promise he had allowed himself to forget until just this instant. If you will save me, I will serve you forever. And then, standing under a circus tent on a clear night in downtown Los Angeles, Louis felt rain falling. The rain that had saved his life after he had uttered that promise. It was the last flashback he would ever have. Louis let go of Cynthia and turned toward Graham. He felt supremely alive. He began walking as a person who had accepted this faith. This is it, said Graham. God has spoken to you. You come on. As they went home, Cynthia kept her eyes on Louis. When they entered the apartment, Louis went straight to his cache of liquor. It was the time of night when the need usually took hold of him. But for the first time in years, Louis had no desire to drink. He carried the bottles to the sink, opened them, and poured them down the drain. Then he hurried through the apartment, gathering packs of cigarettes, a secret stash of girly magazines, everything that was part of his ruined years, and he heaved it all down the trash chute. In the morning, he woke feeling cleansed. For the first time in 5 years, the bird hadn't come into his dreams. The bird would never come again. Louis dug out that Bible that had been issued to him by the Air Corps. He walked to Barnsdall Park, found a spot under a tree, sat down, and began reading. Resting in the shade and the stillness, Louis felt profound peace. When he thought of his history, what resonated with him now was not all that he had suffered, but the divine love that he believed had intervened to save him. He was not the worthless, broken, forsaken man that the bird had striven to make of him. In a single silent moment, his rage, his fear, his humiliation, and helplessness had fallen away. That morning, he believed, he was a new creation. And then a year passed since he walked into Billy Graham's tent, and Louis had worked to keep that promise. He'd begun a new life as a Christian speaker, telling his story all over America. Louis and Cynthia were barely getting by, but their connection to each other had been renewed and deepened. They were blissful together. So there's hope for those who are in a desperate situation. Louie's story is proof that miracles do happen. Remember where we left our couple? They were dancing the dance of reconciliation, rejoicing in being with each other. That's the result we look for as we follow God's advice about conflict. Think of what our marriages can be like if, when we have conflict, we take a step forward. Imagine it, marriages where we remember the good, where we fight fair, where we pray for each other, forgive each other, and where we get help when we need it. It will be awesome. It will be a place where you will feel safe and loved and cherished. It will be a place where our children feel love from both of their parents, and they see healthy ways to resolve conflict. It's what God wants for you and for me. And he has shown that he does provide through Louie's story, through the Song of Solomon couples, and through many others in this room. And I hope that we all want to join them.